B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, February 25th, 2020. It's Fat Tuesday, and if you're Catholic, I guess you have to get ready for Lent. Tonight, another critical debate being held in South Carolina in advance of that state's primary, which happens this weekend. And it is fascinating to see the shift from just last week, where newcomer Mike Bloomberg got the treatment of, like some guy who's rushing a fraternity. But tonight it's expected that all of the fire will be focused on the front runner, Bernie Sanders. And as I wrote in the headline for this podcast, Fidel Castro looms large in tonight's debate. And while I don't make a lot of predictions, I do expect that we're going to see most of the candidates attempt to attack Sanders because of his response to a gotcha question from Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes this past Sunday. And Cooper asked him about comments he had made over 40 years ago about how the Castro government, called a regime by Cold Warriors and inside the Beltway experts, had a high literacy rate. And Cooper set the stage for a wave of attacks that are focused on Sanders' socialism, his support for the Sandinistas and other governments that were under attack during the Reagan era. And Bernie Sanders is on the right side of history. But seeing an opportunity to try to diminish him in the eyes of certain voters, we're going to see a lot of focus on Cuba. And Tulsi Gabbard isn't invited to this debate, but if she were there, she would be shifting the focus to regime change wars, talking about Yemen, talking about the intentions of Trump toward a conflict with Iran, talking about Syria. But as we saw last week, there was no time for foreign policy because it was all about one candidate attacking another, Pete against Amy, the gang against Bloomy. We're also not going to hear anything about domestic surveillance, and there's so many other issues that have been excluded so that we can talk about minutia of healthcare policies. So Tom Steyer is back on the debate stage, and I, for one, think that it's time for him to retire from this campaign. He started off as a billionaire who was going to run as a single-issue candidate on climate change. And now I think his ego has gotten the better of him, and he sees himself as a realistic presidential candidate, more moderate than Sanders. And you don't hear him talk exclusively about climate change the way he originally did. Maybe that'll be different tonight. But it's clear that there's no viability for Tom Steyer. Now, I do recognize that when somebody like me says that some other candidate who I don't support should get out of the race, it doesn't play that well. And I know that supporters of Elizabeth and Amy and Pete and Joe all believe that their candidate should stay in and the others should get out. And 7 days out from Super Tuesday, where it's expected that Sanders is going to clean up and that Mike Bloomberg is going to clean out the dead wood of the Democratic parade of candidates. So it is a bizarre moment as we see a lot of focus aimed at trivial matters. We'll get to some of those that have been advanced by the Bloomberg campaign in a moment. But to his credit, Bernie has answered the burning question, how are you going to pay for it all? And, you know, I went to Florida recently. I stayed with my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Pat and Mike, and Mike voted for Trump in 2016. He tells me he doesn't want to do it again, but he needs to see Bernie explain how he's going to pay for all of the goodies that he is dangling before voters. Well, last night on a CNN town hall, Sanders produced a fact sheet. It's available now on his website. And he shows that in order to pay for Medicare for all, he'll hike the top marginal tax rate on income over $10 million to 52%. That's still lower than Eisenhower. Repeal the GOP corporate tax cuts. Restore the corporate rate to 35%, taxing capital gains at the same rate as wages, and enacting a 4% income-based premium paid by employees that exempts the first $29,000 for a family of four. To fund his plan to wipe out student loan debt and make public colleges, universities, and trade schools tuition-free. The estimate is $2.2 trillion over 10 years. And Sanders' Wall Street tax would raise an estimated $2.4 trillion over that time period. On the Green New Deal, according to the campaign, we would slash military spending by $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years, eliminate federal fossil fuel subsidies, make companies pay their pollution through litigation, fees, and taxes, pay for their pollution, and generating $6.4 trillion in revenue from the wholesale of energy produced by regional power marketing administrations. So Bernie does have a plan on how to pay for it. All this, of course, requires the long slog through Congress. And a lot of people ignore that when they imagine that what Bernie proposes is exactly what is going to be enacted. Anybody who pays attention knows that that is not the case. But I find that especially media pundits are quite literal when they're talking about Bernie's plans and much more generous when they talk about the ideas of less contentious people from their point of view. And by the way, the folks over at Yale University, publishing in The Lancet, say the options laid out by Senator Sanders will more than cover the cost of Medicare for all. And even the Washington Post said the Lancet study shows national single-payer health care system would save tens of thousands of lives every year and hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, those are long-term savings, and I do understand that in the short term, there will be costs and there will be job displacements in the for-profit insurance industry. But Sanders also has ideas on how to address that. So yesterday I cited a news article in the New York Times about how Bernie Sanders is the Teflon candidate. And some of you who've been listening for a long time may know that back in 2008, 2009, I said that Barack Obama had a new and improved version of Teflon called Leftlon, and that nothing that came at him from the left would stick. So today it's the Washington Post's turn. Headline reads, Democrats fear backlash from criticizing Sanders and defeat if they don't. And they note the contradiction that Bloomberg says he'll spend what it takes to help Bernie Sanders win the White House if Bernie wins the Democratic nomination. But he's now spending furiously to prevent that from happening. Of course, it's not expected that Bloomy would run out of money, so I guess he can, play this game if he wants to. And this Post report continues. The contradiction points to the twisted logic set to dominate tonight's debate in South Carolina. The 6 other candidates on stage have about a week left to blunt Sanders' momentum. And so one thing that I want to remind people, there's a lot of desperate attack on Bernie Sanders coming from candidates who really are out of the race. They just have not faced the facts yet. Back in 1988, Al Gore was desperate to catch up with Mike Dukakis in the Democratic primaries. And he released the first ad featuring Mike Dukakis making the decision to furlough Willie Horton, the prisoner who, while he was on a furlough, committed other crimes. And that's what derailed the Dukakis campaign. And my fear is that at this stage of the campaign, desperate Democrats are going to sling mud that has shelf life into the fall campaign. And it will be seized upon by Trump with, his war chest and the very effective targeting that the Trump campaign used in 2016. Here's another quote from the Post article. The result is that Sanders' rivals have been moving gingerly to shift their messages since he swept the Nevada caucuses Saturday. Rather than target him over the underlying concern about whether he's capable of beating Trump, they have largely been attacking him from the left, arguing that he's not sufficiently aligned with the Democratic Party's core values. Now, when I read that, I scratched my head and I said, whose left are they talking about? Pete Buttigieg does not attack Bernie from the left. It's coming from the center right. And the attacks that have been mounted about Bernie's disloyalty to the Democratic Party, the charges from Biden that Bernie thought about primarying Barack Obama back in 2012, these only play to Bernie's advantage because these insiders in the Democratic establishment don't recognize how vulnerable they are because of the corruption of the Democratic Party. And I hear loyalists, I see them on Facebook, attempting to slam Bernie. He's not a Democrat, We all know that. It's one of the reasons I support him, because I'm not a Democrat, and I don't want to be. Next, the Washington Post published a piece after saying that the attacks either don't work or backfire, where they analyze the expected attack lines coming from the candidates arrayed against Bernie on the debate stage tonight. So they predict that Pete Buttigieg will argue that Sanders could hurt Democrats' chances to keep the House and win the Senate. And many people know that for Sanders to win requires a wave election, and that wave could carry many Democrats to victory in the House and the Senate. Joe Biden is expected to attack him on failing to admit that Sanders' plans would raise taxes for some middle-class people. And, of course, it's a real selective approach because Biden will say, Bernie's going to raise your taxes, and Bernie will say, but I'm going to lower your insurance premiums to zero. And the taxes will not be greater than the cost you've been paying for insurance. And so they've used that attack for a while now, and it has not seemed to have landed very effectively. So Bloomberg is going to say that Sanders is loony and trot out stuff from 50 years ago when he wrote some admittedly weird stuff, that cancer may have been caused by sexual repression. But 50 years, really? Does anybody think that that is relevant to this campaign? So based on the gotcha question from Anderson Cooper, Bernie's comments about Cuba, Fidel Castro, Mike Bloomberg's campaign flashed out a bunch of tweets yesterday that were supposed to be tongue-in-cheek. For example, should we really hold Gaddafi's extrajudicial killings of political opponents against him when he also built a pretty sweet countrywide irrigation system? Another one, Putin is willing to poison anyone who disagrees with him, but have you seen how that guy looks without a shirt? Delish. So the hashtag is Bernie on despots. And there were at least 4, maybe 5 of these, including Idi Amin, Stalin, Bashar al-Assad, Kim Jong-un. And, Kim Jong-un bears no relation to the kind of socialism that Sanders talks about. And so these are Cold War relics. And the only people who they appear to be targeted at are the baby boomers, people my age, who are the ones who are most resistant to feeling the burn and getting on board. Bloomberg also has some African-American surrogates out to attack Sanders in advance of the black-dominant voter population making its choices in South Carolina. And one of the attacks is on Bernie because he supported the 1990s crime bills that were largely written by Joe Biden as chair of the House Judiciary Committee. And they want to attack Sanders for voting for some of this bad legislation and hope that nobody bothers to mention the connection to Joe Biden. That's how dishonest so many of these attacks are. And I'm not going to name names here, but I have this article with 4 African-American leaders, former mayor of Baltimore, former mayor of Flint, Michigan, attacking Bernie. And I'll bet you this $5 bill right here that if you went and looked up the contributions from Mike Bloomberg, you would find that these same individuals are essentially on his payroll. Now, I've been getting quite a bit of postal mail from the Bloomberg campaign. It's because I am an independent, no-party preference voter here in California, and Mike thinks that's where he's going to pick up some ground on Super Tuesday. So here's a full-color flyer, 4 pages, of Mike Bloomberg getting the job done, ensure that every uninsured American has affordable health coverage, while guaranteeing people who like their insurance can keep it. But he doesn't say how he'll achieve that. And like everything about Bloomberg, he just asserts things in a very confident way with millions of dollars of TV advertising to amplify it. But he doesn't offer any ideas about how he's going to write and pass critical legislation. Here's a letter from Margaret Brick, described as a New York City resident. Her son Tommy was the first New York City firefighter killed after 9/11. And in walked Mayor Bloomberg. As soon as I saw him, I knew what it meant. And this comes on a letterhead that is obviously printed by the campaign. At the bottom, it has the disclaimer, paid for by Mike Bloomberg 2020. And I have a similar letter from Mike himself. But there's no effort at all at personalization. It's just the idea, by flooding my mailbox every day, that I'm just going to be knocked over by what a great candidate Mike Bloomberg says he is. Meanwhile, in the news columns of the New York Times today, a conclusion based on really sketchy data. So as you know, we've had 2 caucuses, Iowa and Nevada, and the primary in New Hampshire. And the New York Times, based on these 3 states, and, caucuses are pretty wobbly affairs, the headline reads, Sanders says he'll attract a wave of new voters, period. It hasn't happened, period. And I would add after that second, it hasn't happened yet. Now, it is fair to say that the turnout in Iowa was flat. New Hampshire and Nevada did have modest increases in participation, but they don't mention that there is still a large field of candidates, and to suggest that Bernie alone is the one who has to attract bigger turnout, I think is misplaced at this stage. Now, when we get into the general election is when there's real proof in the claim, and it may come up short. I freely admit that. But in the breakdown in Nevada, young voters turned out a couple of clicks higher than last time, and Bernie dominated the category. Latinos are now a category that he has deep strength in. And the African-American vote for Sanders in Nevada was not shabby either. On my Facebook feed this morning, a lot of people were posting and endorsing a column from Tom Friedman. He's still scared shitless about Bernie. And his opening line is, if this election turns out to be just between a self-proclaimed socialist and an undiagnosed sociopath, we will be in a terrible, terrible place as a country. How do we prevent that? So he floats a fantasy of a Democratic team of rivals, and that Sanders or Bloomberg, he doesn't care which, could lead the ticket and populate it with everybody else who's been running. Bloomberg is Secretary of the Treasury. Biden is Secretary of State. Warren is Health and Human Services. Kamala Harris as Attorney General, Mayor Pete as Homeland Security, Tom Steyer, Secretary of National Infrastructure. That job doesn't even exist. Oh, and Cory Booker, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Oh, Mitt Romney as Commerce Secretary. Now, Obama attempted this by putting Hillary in his cabinet, by trying to put Republicans in his cabinet. He named one, a guy from, what was his name, Judd something from New Hampshire, and he bailed out 10 minutes after he was nominated. During the desperate days of 2016, Ted Cruz announced that his running mate would be Carly Fiorina, which was a pretty dumb choice. And we know that Vice President Fiorina has done an amazing job since she and Ted swept into power. Now, this one really shocked me. Michelle Goldberg is a dyed-in-the-wool opponent of Bernie Sanders, a Clintonista, if you will. She's an opinion columnist at the New York Times. And she's also a heavy believer in Russiagate. But despite all that, today she wrote Putin would hate President Bernie Sanders. And she declares that Sanders would not be a stooge for Russia, that he would not do anything to try to get Russian support during the election. Now, all this is based, of course, on the fable of Russian interference in 2016 and these scurrilous reports that have surfaced that Russia is meddling in 2020, but we have no clue how they're doing it. We're just supposed to be eternally fearful and vigilant of that Russian who's going to bend your mind into doing something that you don't want to do. So I'm linking to Goldberg's piece. Here's one. Throughout his career, Sanders has repeatedly excoriated American foreign policy, refusing to accede to the myth of America's fundamental innocence. In a race with Trump, he would represent American exceptionalism. Because, he said, as the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth, we have got to help lead the struggle to defend and expand a rules-based international order in which law, not might, makes right. Well, that's a different brand of exceptionalism, and I'll take it. She also says, believing in Russiagate, under Trump, the U.S. has abandoned the pretense of backing democracy and human rights, meaning there are no longer any great powers that even pretend to put morality at the center of foreign affairs. The horror of this era isn't just the emergence of an axis of authoritarianism, but the fact that there's so few allies to counter it. If Sanders were elected president, that could change. His unlikely ascendance would be a blow against the corrosive cynicism in which authoritarianism thrives. Wow. And just for those of you who are hovering in the corner, afraid that Putin's going to knock on your door and brainwash you, I want to recommend the latest article at The Nation by Aaron Mate. And a couple of grabs here. He opens this way. The latest round of Russian interference panic followed a familiar script. Vague leaks that U.S. intelligence officials have determined that Russia intends to boost both Trump and Sanders made front-page headlines. Cable news pundits and Democratic luminaries seized the moment with ritual alarmism. The Russians are coming, said Joe Scarborough. Putin's puppet is trying to cover it up, says Lawrence O'Donnell. Oh, no, that's Don Lemon of CNN. They all run together. A little later, he writes, the outcry proceeded despite a stunning lack of evidence or even a single detail on what the supposed Russian interference entails. It's not clear what form the Russian assistance has taken, the Washington Post noted, and the New York Times added Russia has a new playbook of as yet undetectable methods. And Mate asks, if Russian methods are undetectable, how can U.S. officials detect them? Perhaps there is nothing to detect. Then CNN reported that the characterization of the available intelligence was misleading and overstated. More from Mate. Embedded in this playbook is an elitist condescension toward the public targeted by it. Critical issues that affect regular people's lives are relegated to the margins, replaced by breathless panic that presupposes them to be malleable enough to be duped by Russian memes and bots. It also has no relationship to the reality of what this supposed Russian operation actually amounted to. Juvenile posts on social media that few people actually saw, and that seldom even mention the 2016 election. There's more here, but you get the idea. And I think until there is some evidence that we should be concerned about this alleged Russian meddling here in 2020, I think we can safely ignore it. Chris Matthews has apologized to Sanders for the ridiculous comments he made on Saturday after Sanders cleaned up in the Nevada caucus. And what he said was, the general calls up Churchill and says, it's over. Churchill says, how can it be? You got the greatest army in Europe. How can it be over? It's over. And this was the comparison to the Nazi takeover of France during World War II. At the top of yesterday's show, Chris Matthews said, Senator Sanders, I'm sorry for comparing anything from that tragic era in which so many suffered, especially the Jewish people, to an electoral result of which you were the well-deserved winner. And Matthews, seeming a little chastened, says, this is going to be a hard-fought, heated campaign. In the days and weeks and months ahead, I will strive to do a better job of elevating the political discussion. Yeah, good luck, Chris. And as I alluded to a little earlier, there is some book on the possibility that Pete and Amy, that's Buttigieg and Klobuchar, will attack each other again tonight. And that's a lose-lose proposition. It appears to stem from personal animosity. Oh, and Joe gaffed again. Yesterday, Biden was talking to a group in Charleston, and he said, where I come from, you don't go very far unless you ask. My name's Joe Biden. I'm a Democratic candidate for the United States Senate. Look me over. If you like what you see, help out. Well, I hope somebody helped him out to say, Joe, you're running for president this time. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Let's see who's on the list today. Patrick Rainsberger, Dick Atlee, Terry Paris, and Billy Cook, chipping in $5, $10 a month. You can do it too. All you have to do is drop by peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. As always, if you don't like PayPal, you can communicate with me at my P.O. Box, number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Some interesting alternative media coverage of the Julian Assange extradition hearings underway in London. And I start with Kevin Gosztola, who is on the scene and reporting at Shadowproof. He talks about how the defense began its presentation today by revealing that Sheldon Adelson, who was the biggest contributor to Donald Trump in 2016, Adelson hired a Spanish-based security company called Undercover Global, and nominally they were going to provide security for his mega yacht. But they also executed a side deal to wire the Embassy of Ecuador in London, where Assange was holed up on asylum. They spied on privileged meetings between Assange and his lawyers. They planted microphones in the women's bathroom. And all of this material was uploaded daily to a remote server that was accessed by U.S. intelligence. So did the CIA orchestrate this? Well, they appear to have deniability because this was a contract with Adelson. But it shows the extent to which they did spy on Assange and violate his constitutional rights under the U.S. Constitution, and they argue that he doesn't hold any rights under our Constitution. I'm not so sure about that myself. They also talk about the visit from Dana Rohrabacher, the Republican former congressman, and an activist named Charles Johnson, who came to meet with Assange in August of 2017, and the defense attorneys argue that the discussion of a possible pardon showed the political nature of the whole Assange case. And British law does not allow extradition of people who are primarily considered political suspects or, being extradited for political reasons. I really want to encourage you to read Craig Murray's account. He is the former ambassador from Britain to one of the stands. I think it was Kazakhstan. I don't remember now. Anyway, he got into the courtroom, into the spectators' gallery. There were only 15 other people allowed. And he describes the attitude of the judge in the case, Vanessa Baritzer. She's got Julian Assange in a bulletproof glass cage in the back of the courtroom, which makes it very hard for him to hear and follow the proceedings. Murray writes, it doesn't matter to Baritzer or the Chief Judge Arbuthnot if there's any genuine need for Assange to be in a bulletproof box. The intention is to humiliate Assange and instill in the rest of us horror at the vast crushing power of the state. Then he goes on to describe events that have not been covered in the corporate media. He details the presentation of James Lewis, who made a presentation on behalf of the United States, and he said the first part of it was all aimed at the media. And they cited The Guardian, the New York Times, and other papers that have editorialized criticism of Assange after, of course, accepting his leaks and profiting by publishing them. And he describes how this attorney, Lewis, got himself in a really thick, a thicket, a sticky wicket, if we're going to talk British here. So he first said that the New York Times and other outlets that published Julian Assange's WikiLeaks leaked documents are not on trial here. But then the judge pointed out that Britain's 1989 Official Secrets Act really doesn't describe people who are not vulnerable to prosecution. And it says basically by publishing it, they could be, criminally liable under British law. He expresses that much better than I just did. So please follow the link and read his report. It runs almost 20 pages, but it is a fascinating look at what's really going on in that courtroom. But Britain's Guardian, which of course was central to the Ed Snowden disclosures, and when Glenn Greenwald was writing for them, they were partnering with WikiLeaks, and then they stopped under heavy pressure from the British government. And since then, The Guardian has embarrassed itself quite a bit, mostly behind the reporting of one guy named Luke Harding. Harding is the one who claims that Paul Manafort visited Julian Assange, and there's never been any evidence for that. But notably, The Guardian is on the defensive because Harding, when he published a book, included a password that ultimately allowed people to open up WikiLeaks secured files, and it revealed the names of U.S. sources. That is now being played as an intentional failure on the part of Julian Assange that put American sources and people at risk. There's never been any evidence of anybody who's been compromised by WikiLeaks disclosures. And so they are struggling quite a bit to build a case that there was actual harm and not just embarrassment caused by the work of Julian Assange. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have gone public, saying that the coronavirus is likely to break out in American communities and urging us to be prepared for it. And the dimensions of this really do appear to be reaching a pandemic level. I still have questions about where this virus originated and whether it is some form of biological warfare. But it is on the loose. We are vulnerable. For example, the U.S. has stockpiled 30 million N95 masks. These are the surgical masks that people wear. But the Democrats are ripping into Trump and his administration because the Trumpers have announced a $2.5 billion emergency budget request, half of which is being diverted from unspent Ebola response money. And Pelosi issued a statement last night that the Trump request is long overdue, completely inadequate. For almost 2 years, the administration has left critical positions in charge of managing pandemics at the National Security Council and Department of Homeland Security completely vacant. His most recent budget called for slashing funding for the CDC which is on the front lines of this emergency. Americans need a coordinated, fully funded, whole-of-government response to keep us safe. Chuck Schumer mixed it up with Trump as well, and he responded that Schumer is incompetent and just, bullshit. And Rush Limbaugh has opined that this is a weaponized virus that is aimed at bringing Trump down. He said it's simply a version of the common cold, but we have 2,700 people worldwide reported to have died, some 80,000 infected, and I'm not sure Rush has any idea of what he's talking about. Listener Linda Lewis does. She was a whistleblower when she worked in disaster preparedness for the U.S. government. She writes that she has identified a dozen concerns about the level of American preparation. Number one, we lack universal health care. We lack a robust health care system. We have inadequate sick leave rights for workers. We have widespread distrust of government and the media, an administration that opposes science, an administration that opposes public assistance and punishes some immigrants for accepting assistance, a president who feels compelled to say everything is great, even when it's not, a highly independent population that may resist restrictions, reliance on manufacturing in countries with worse healthcare systems and long supply chains, a long history of poor emergency planning and response by government agencies, and a population that is largely living paycheck to paycheck, who will likely delay needed medical attention. So Trump has been to India the last few days, and I thought I would get away with just ignoring it. But the reports indicate that as the world's number one hater of Muslims, that Trump was welcomed to India by the Hindu nationalist government of Narendra Modi. And gangs of Hindus and Muslims have been fighting in various neighborhoods, and 11 people, including a police officer, have died since Sunday. That's the true legacy of Trump's visit to India. And finally today, Hosni Mubarak has died at the age of 91. He was the military dictator of Egypt. And one of the great things that Obama did was he acknowledged the early stages of the Arab Spring, and Obama intentionally forced Mubarak out of power. It was a brief, fleeting moment of courage on Obama's part because after supporting the election that led to the selection of Mohamed Morsi as the first Muslim leader of Egypt, the U.S. supported the coup that took him out and led to the rise of an even more virulent dictator than Mubarak. That would be General al-Sisi, who rules Egypt today. I won't be shedding any tears for the passing of Mubarak, but I do have one tear for the loss of human rights-based U.S. foreign policy that briefly surfaced during the Obama years. Thanks for listening to my News and Comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.